Against the backdrop of a beautiful castle stood a young couple. The man was obviously embarrassed and was trying to communicate something really important. Across from him was a beautiful lady. Then the man finally gathered his will in his fist and turned to the lady and said that he had to talk to her about something very important to him. He tried to speak the first time, but in the end, seeing the beautiful girl, he couldn't utter it. But he didn't give up in trying to remove his embarrassment. He spoke again. He wanted to let you know that ever since he started working here, he always looked at the girl. She saw his embarrassment and realized that it was very awkward for him to address her. She supported Mr. Raffens in her mind because he was good at saying what he wanted to say, but at one point he stammered and made an excuse to himself that ever since he'd started working at her house, he always looked at the incredible sunset. And then, embarrassed, he looked away from the girl, wondering if she liked this beautiful evening view. But the mistress didn't seem satisfied with that answer. She looked around. Her hair was developing in the evening breeze, and she noticed that it really was already sunset. Then the girl thought that she would have to do something she didn't want to do. But despite her discontent, she decided that there was no other choice. The mistress looked at the handsome young man across from her. She asked him with a completely innocent face, is that all he wanted to say, because she was so intrigued when he decided to talk to her alone. And after she caused some faint tears, she'd warned him that this might be their last meeting. So he should be honest with her, at least for now. The guy was surprised and concerned and started questioning the young lady as to why this had to be the last meeting and didn't understand how to respond. Then the girl put her hands to her heart and still very innocently asked if she should be the first to confess something to him. But the young man stopped her and assured her that he was ready to confess and say what he had planned, and then, putting his hands to his heart and looking at the interlocutor with embarrassment, said that he had loved her at first sight. The girl seemed very pleased with that answer. She was still staring intently at the guy across from her, and she held out her hand to him, and he did the same. Their fingers intertwined awkwardly and locked together. The young lad was shocked by this and equally embarrassed. The girl smiled happily and, looking at him, informed him that the young man was also always in her heart. At that moment, the protagonist opened her eyes. She tried to figure out where she was but quickly realized that she was at home in bed and turned to the man who was lying next to her. She told her employee that she had returned from the dream world, but when she looked at him she found that he was sound asleep and did not pay attention to the heroine's awakening. She gave him her displeased look and continued to stare at him. She clearly didn't like the fact that he was sleeping in the workplace. Then, deciding to put this situation down for a while, the protagonist tried to get up, but then her whole body was pierced by a terrible pain, as if lightning bolts went from her head to her feet, and she let out a strange groan of extreme pain. Then from this moan, which was loud enough, the worker woke up, who immediately noticed the girl's pain and rose sharply to run up and help her. But in the end he tripped and fell ridiculously at her feet. The main character, looking at this shameful picture, did not understand why she kept such a ridiculous employee around her who could not even help when she needed him. Afterward, when she came to her senses, she said goodbye to the old man she'd had a session with before. Closing the doors behind him, the girl thought happily that she would finally be able to get a good rest, as her whole body was still very sore. She walked back into the house and went into the kitchen. The first thing she saw was the dining table, which was literally bursting with food. Her worker praised her for doing a good job, and now as a reward she could have a good rest and good meal. The girl was very happy about this surprise. Then the guy looked at her and said that she deserved it all, because last time the main character's work was very difficult, but the guy was very glad that it was over quickly, because at some point he thought that they were going to stay up late. The girl looked angrily at the worker and realized that apparently he was more worried about having to work extra hours than about the fact that she was tired. But after missing this situation and scaring the employee enough, they finally sat down at the table. Then the boy, looking at the girl carefully, inquired and asked Sonador how did she manage to get the timid grandfather Raffens to confess his lover's affection. She informed him that that was why she was a dream master, so she had methods of dealing with difficulties like this. The man sitting across from him was daydreaming and musing in his voice that if he were a native of Descentia, he too would also be bragging about some useful and interesting ability, and perhaps even working for the Knights of Rysel instead of being here now. The girl looked at him unhappily and asked, is he trying to imply something and is not satisfied with working with the main character? The guy just waved his hands in a frightened manner and assured her that he was completely satisfied with his work. He was just saying that, and he didn't want another job. Southern Isle of Descentia, for some obscure reason, whether it was the powerful mana that permeated the island or the divine blessing possessed by each of the inhabitants of the Holy Land. However, every Descension was born with some unique ability. The abilities varied widely, both in nature and practice. Of course, they didn't give as much of an advantage as true magic, but still the natives were highly valued because of these abilities. So peace and prosperity did not last long on that island. One unfortunate day the conquerors came to their island, and their leader informed them that from now on every dissension would be the property of the empire, and they would be given new names and called to serve as masters and work for the empire of Arca. The main character was from there. Her name was Sonador, but her name was actually an abbreviation for dream filled with precious shards of reality. That was the original meaning of her name that her mother had given her. And just like her name, she was able to fulfill the fantasies of a person who could not be realized in reality, invading their dreams by touching them. She was better known as the Dream Maker, helping people's dreams come true, if only in their sleep. The girl enjoyed her dinner, thinking that she was very lucky that she was not a slave, because many of her people were used that way. And thanks to a good number of orders, the girl could not worry about starving to death. But suddenly the girl with a bright smile on her face began to reflect on the fact that this time the clients paid her very well. So she had not tried in vain, and it comforted her. But suddenly the doors to her house opened and 5 uninvited guests entered the room. At the head was a fair-haired man who behaved very wary. He immediately noticed the 2 young men sitting at the table in the living room and looking at the girl asked if this was the place where the Dream Master practiced. Her assistant said that unfortunately for those who came, their workday was over for the day, so asked them to come back another time. One of the guards of the man who had entered tried to explain who he was dealing with, but the gentleman in charge gestured for him to be silent. The girl didn't understand why these people were making a ruckus in her house, but all she could do was look at them worriedly and wait for an explanation. Then the chief, reaching out his hands toward the hood to remove it, informed her that he needed her help in awakening the man who could not wake up. When the hood was removed from his head and the girl saw his face, her emotions changed. She was shocked at the incomprehension of what this man was doing in her house and why he was looking for her. The calmer continued, addressing the Dream Master Sonador that his son had fallen into an eternal sleep. He begged her for help 500 years ago. The greedy ruler of the empire, Archluca V, declared war on dissent, a true manna spring on the border of a continent. The emperor ordered his soldiers to punish each and every one of those who opposed the empire. The Imperials were ruthlessly killing people left and right. Among them was the woman who watched in horror as her loved ones were taken from her. She watched as scarlet blood soaked the ground and shrill screams lingered in the air. It was the strongest enchantress of the entire island of Descentia. The woman, looking at her home being turned into a hell on earth, frantically shouted a curse that beasts that were born without the blessing of heaven would be denied earth as well as heaven at the end of their journey. Luke V did not heed these words, believing them to be a death delusion. However, the empire soon fell into chaos, and all the descendants of the imperial family who were born after those events were extremely weak. And on the day of their adulthood, each of them fell into a dreamless sleep. And this dream lasted until they were old enough to be taken away by death. As a result, the imperial family lost all its heirs and was cut off. Duke Pylon, who managed to gain the trust of the people in those troubled times, took the throne. He changed his name to Ark and ruled the empire. The girl pinched her cheek so that if this was all a bad dream, she could wake up as soon as possible. But unfortunately, it wasn't a dream. Then the emperor turned to the heroine and asked her to drop all formalities and get down to business. Her assistant came up to her and excitedly informed the girl that those famous knights of Razel were next to the emperor. The girl waved him away, informing him that she didn't care at all and it could be even the mother of God. Since it didn't matter in their situation, and it should be obvious to the guy that they were in serious trouble. So she asked him to bring tea as soon as possible. The man excitedly ran off to the kitchen and left them alone. When he returned, he arranged the cups on the table. The girl began to talk to those who came. Then the emperor did not delay his question and asked the heroine if she could awaken his son from his sleep. The girl inquired who exactly he meant. Afterwards, she suggested that it might be the crown prince. The emperor confirmed her conjecture, explaining that his condition was very coma-like, but it was a dream. But the girl calmly said that she couldn't help his son because to use her power, direct contact with a person was necessary. And then she added fearfully that such an ordinary craftswoman like her was not allowed to even stand next to His Highness, let alone touch him. Afterwards, she told the emperor that such behavior on her part would be an insult to the great family. The emperor said that undoubtedly she was right and what she had said was indeed a problem, but since there was nothing to be done, he was willing to do it. And then, turning to the girl, he said that she was their last hope, so in such a situation he was ready to do anything, and she could ask for any reward if she could help. But the emperor said that, of course, Sonador had the right to refuse, but in that case, the emperor did not guarantee her unharmed, since the girl now knew the secret of the imperial family itself. The girl sadly realized that apparently she had been given a choice without a choice, so she just kept silent. The emperor continued to explain that it seemed that what had happened to His Highness was the curse of Descentia, which was still working. The girl asked excitedly if he was referring to the curse of 500 years ago, but the man confirmed her conjecture and said that it was the one in question. He explained that his son had been weak in body and soul since his birth, and on the day of his majority he fell into eternal sleep. And afterwards, the emperor added that fortunately, rumors had reached him that the protagonist had somehow cured the insomnia of one count's wife. The girl realized with pride in the work she had done that it was Lady Vishtir she was talking about. Without straying from the topic of discussion, the emperor informed the protagonist that if she was able to cure someone who couldn't sleep, then perhaps she could also handle the opposite situation. The girl stood up and with all her determination tried to convey to the emperor that it was not the same thing, because insomnia could not be compared to a curse. If His Highness was really suffering from the curse, then there was nothing the dissension could do to help him. But the emperor instantly and very confidently looked at her and told her that just because she was a native of Descentia, it might work. And then looking at her with a threatening look at her surrounded by his guards, he asked if she would agree to help his son. Her aide standing next to her was begging the girl with sparks of pleading from his eyes. Even from his face, it was obvious that he was begging her to agree. She realized how foolish she was being, though, because his reaction was caused only by the presence of the legendary knights of the emperor's personal squad, whom he admired. The girl, unhappily, said that if she refused, she would lose her head, and if she agreed, she might be able to live longer because the probability of success was extremely low, and even in such a case of success, no one could guarantee her safety. Seeing that the girl was thinking for too long, the emperor said that he would be willing to grant her the title if she wished, and noted that it was an extremely rare opportunity for a master like her. So the girl would have to think about it. Then her laborer had correctly pointed out that His Majesty was indeed desperate since he was willing to grant the title to some master from the island of Descentia. Terry, that was the worker's name, was entirely right, and the girl understood it perfectly well but refused the title. And afterwards she said that she was not going to claim it, but wanted to ask for something else as a reward, though she would not demand equal rights for the dissensions and natives of the empire. So she asked, if her treatment was successful, to make the natives of the island and her people free of the empire. The emperor looked at her gravely and carefully. It was well known that craftsmen were not even considered as livestock in the empire, and the natives of Descentia had to endure taunts and insults just because they were foreigners. In the worst case, they could be deprived of their lives. The girl continued, explaining that to put her demand in simpler terms, she wanted the masters to be able to freely leave the empire at will. She realized that it was foolish to demand money as payment in such a situation, as she could earn it on her own. But there was no way she could miss this chance, so she had to at least try. The emperor sipped his tea and informed that such a request was very impertinent on the part of the girl. She had already had time to say goodbye to her head, but suddenly, putting the cup on the table, the emperor said that if she really succeeded in waking up the only heir to the empire, he would agree to fulfill her conditions, so everything depended only on her. He also promised to shower her with money for her success, and to allow the masters to leave the empire freely. Afterwards, the emperor turned to the dream mistress again and asked her to stop the curse of Descentia from taking root in the empire. The girl reasonably inquired what the man meant when he said he would shower her with money. Then the emperor said that he would give her about 10 billion bucks and asked if it would be enough for her. Hearing this figure, the girl almost fainted, and afterwards the emperor added that her assistant Terry would be able to take lessons from one of the knights of Reisel's squad. The emperor added that her assistant would be able to take lessons from one of Reisel's knights, but the girl decided to make another request of hers to His Majesty. He agreed to hear her out. Then the protagonist said that in order to wake up the crown prince, she had to know something about his surroundings or important things about him. She assumed that the prince would have to share such information with him, since he was his father after all. And afterwards, she explained that the emperor should share such information with her, if possible, but he emotionlessly informed her that he had nothing to tell her, as all the information about his son was already written down in the document he had given her. And then he ordered that after reading it, he should immediately burn all the papers. The girl tried to explain that she needed a little more detail to work with, not just the bare facts about him, and gave an example of what she was interested in. Sonador would like to know what he likes, what he doesn't like, and it would also be best if she also knew every single detail. For example, what time of day he likes the most, and explained that it would help her to set the right atmosphere in his sleep. The man looked at her seriously and asked why the protagonist thought he should know such nonsense. The girl looked at him in bewilderment, thinking that as his father, he was obliged to know at least some of this. Then the emperor, thinking about it, said that although he did not have such information, perhaps his son's nanny could be of some help. Such a statement made the girl glow with joy and the realization that all was not hopeless. But afterward he explained that his nanny was the Marcus consort, and he had recently executed her because she talked too much, and there was no choice but to take her head off. The girl, clearly disappointed, inquired about His Highness's friends and hoped there must be at least one friend. But the emperor said that his son had never had any friends. After such words, the girl was in real despair, not understanding how she could cope with such an impossible task. In the end, the knights and the emperor left and the protagonist was able to rest. When she woke up, she spent a lot of time picking up the right outfits and hairstyle. But she didn't seem to be getting anywhere, so she called her assistant Terry and asked the guy how she looked. But the guy only laughed as she looked disheveled and as if she had just gotten out of bed 5 minutes ago. The guy, still laughing, asked, "Is the protagonist going to go to the palace like this?" But suddenly he received confirmation of his suspicions. Hearing this, Terry sincerely warned him not to do that because she looked insanely tired and not very presentable. But Sonador said that there was no need to dress up, since their meeting would be unofficial. Initially, the girl wanted to wear a new dress and style her hair, but the familiar clothes were still more comfortable for her. And afterward, she explained to Terry that for his information, she even combed and ironed all her clothes, so she looked quite dignified. But the guy awkwardly looked her over and informed her that something would have to be done to her hair because it looked like a haystack. Afterward, she reluctantly asked him to come over so he could do something about her hair. And after getting into the taste of the mane, he began to command and said that she had to put on a new dress, her hair was sure to be sprayed with scented oil, and she had to wear a lush petticoat. But his advice was really helpful because the girl looked stunning. She herself was surprised at how good she could look, since she didn't usually spend time on such things. And afterward, Sonador added that it might be their last day, so it would be worth it to dress up for the last time in her life. Then a dream crept into the protagonist's head. She thought that before she died, she really wanted to eat at least one piece of Aunt McLean's chicken, and then she could die without regret. But suddenly a knock brought her out of her contemplation of delicious food. She immediately noticed it and opened the door and asked, "Who's here?" It was one of the knights who informed them that it was time for them to go, as His Majesty had given them plenty of time to take care of all matters before the trip. The girl confessed that the man who had come had frightened her very much, and also resented the fact that all this time he had been standing under the door and eavesdropping on her conversations. But the man turned around without emotion and said they should hit the road and not linger. The girl, frightened, followed him before he got too far away. She bought herself some food, since she hadn't had time to eat breakfast at all in this morning's rush. Then she wondered if she had time to take care of all her chores. The protagonist pondered that perhaps she should talk to Giorgio before running her errand. He was also from Descentia, just like the girl, and he was her only childhood and family friend. However, unlike the soft and calm protagonist, Giorgio was a guy with a rather complicated character. Once, when some Empire native told him that he was just a nasty dissident, he turned around and, instead of ignoring him, beat him to a pulp. The girl admitted that Georgie always gets easily enraged at the mere sight of an arrogant imperial boasting about his position. Rumor has it that the dissensions are gathering an army of like-minded people, a sort of revolutionary movement for freedom. And Georgie is rumored to be their leader. If she contacted him now, she might be in trouble because he would know that she was traveling to the Empire to help the Crown Prince, though not on her own initiative. So the girl decided to drop the idea and talk to the man accompanying her. In an attempt to find a common language with him, the protagonist asked if he had any special preferences in food. The man was only surprised by such a sudden question and did not know how to answer it. Then the main character, still chewing on her fish-shaped cookies, said that nothing brings people together like eating together. And then she said that she knew a couple of good places where they could go for a bite to eat. But he coldly replied that there was no need for it. The girl did not get upset, saying that it was a great waste, because there was a lot of delicious things in the world, and she now had a desire to eat as if it were the last time. And then she started thinking about all the different foods she wanted to eat. Then she asked if her escort had seen the pastry shop across the street from her apartment. Sonador praised it and told her that it made excellent cakes. Her favorite was Black Forest cake. She proudly announced that such delicious cakes could not even be found in the entire empire. The attendant admitted that the local pastry chefs could hardly compare to the imperial ones. The girl did not agree or deny what she said and just decided to find another topic of conversation and asked if the man had some favorite food that could only be tasted here, and reminded him that he had heard her talking about chicken. Sonador continued to praise the place where she was selling. Afterwards, she said that Oni was just a short distance away from it and suggested that they stop by. The owner of the restaurant was sitting there good-naturedly, happy to see her. The attendant only silently wondered how the girl could fit so much food in because she had just eaten a whole bag of fish-shaped buns. She also wants to eat a chicken. Then they sat down. They were immediately approached by a nice-looking woman who inquired what they wished to order and also suggested that the protagonist try the chicken in pink sauce. The man, turning to the girl, informed her that he was leaving that choice up to her. And then finally, for the first time in ages, took off his hood. He was insanely attractive. He had dark gray hair, bright golden eyes, and a scar from a battle wound on his cheek. The girl scrutinized him carefully. Afterward, she squinted her eyes incredulously and asked, "Are imperial knights chosen for their looks?" The one only threatened with a displeased look that she should not dare to insult the knights of the empire, as they had far more abilities than some beauty. Just then, the chicken arrived, and the girl enjoyed it as if it were the last time she had eaten it. While the girl ate, she tried to ask the knight if he knew anything about the crown prince, but he said that he had no information, as he reported to his majesty personally. The girl knew that the crown prince was the perfect heir to the Ark Empire. He possessed outstanding knowledge and appearance, which was especially valued in the empire. His highness absorbed only the best, the noble traits of his father and now deceased mother. If anyone finds out that the man on whom the future of the great empire depends has fallen into a dark, cursed sleep, the turmoil of 500 years ago will return. And that's why the prince's current condition is carefully kept quiet. And she too, as a master of dreams, was hired unofficially. She and Thierry couldn't just show up at the palace. So she thought about it and came up with a great idea. She and Thierry should infiltrate the palace under the guise of servants. The girl thought it was insanely cute since she had always wanted to try on the maid look, but the man opposite coldly explained that it wouldn't work that way because to become a maid you have to undergo a long training, and they didn't have much time. And he said that they would simply come to the palace through the secret passage. The man, stepping down from the carriage they had been provided, approached the two young men and inquired, "Are they ready to travel to the palace?" But the girl, excitedly, asked them to wait a little longer as she really wanted to visit one important place for her last. That's how they ended up in the cemetery. The knight asked the protagonist, "Why did you end up here?" But the girl sadly informed him that this was where her mother rested and she wanted to visit her in case she never came back. The girl remembered her image with annoyance and thought that she would really like to ask her advice if she were alive, as her mom knew much more about their gift than the protagonist. The knight heard her words and thought that since her mother was dead, she was probably all alone. Then the knight gently inquired, "Is she the only dream maker in the entire empire?" He assumed it was because her mother was dead. She awkwardly informed him that that was the case, and as his majesty had said, everything now depended on her alone, and so she was under tremendous pressure. Afterward, looking sadly at her mother's grave, she wept. The man looked at her worriedly and in an attempt to support her asked her to stay strong, because the fate of his highness and the empire depended on her work, and if the heir could come to his senses, the life of the masters would change for the better thanks to her. The girl agreed with his words and seemed filled with determination. Turning to her deceased mother, she apologized for having made such a bold decision, how to help the heir to the empire that had conquered their island. So they set off on a long journey. It is not known how long they traveled by carriage to the imperial palace, but after a certain time of travel, the carriage stopped in the middle of the forest. And suddenly, the knight opened the doors and told them to come out. The girl marveled at such a stopping place and inquired, "Is such a place the most secret passage to the palace?" The knight agreed and explained that the secret passage should be in a place like this to reduce the chances of detection. He then proceeded to remove the protective barrier and drew a symbol and began to recite the spell. The protagonist immediately realized that now the knight dispels the illusion, behind which was a door that led to the unknown. The man told them to take their time getting behind the doors, but warned them to stay close or they might get lost. Afterward, they walked into the darkness. All they had was the light of a single lantern held by the knight. The girl regarded the space around them with positivity and compared it to an ant hole, but the knight informed her that they were not underground at all now, and it was still part of the palace, so they should dispense with any questionable comparisons. The protagonist thought the knight was being a real nerd, but followed him. Then, unexpectedly, the knight stopped near the most ominous of the doors. Some unknown dark aura seemed to gather around it and darkness enveloped it. Then the protagonist groped for her assistant and asked, "Does she really have to go in there alone?" But the man reminded her that she couldn't have a complaint since they had a definite plan. The girl was very upset by this. She hadn't forgotten about their plan, but that room looked very dark and scary. Then the knight, looking her over in all seriousness, asked her to go behind the doors and explained that there would be a room downstairs and his highness would soon be brought there. Once near the ominous door, she entered it, but it soon slammed shut so that the protagonist would not try to escape. The girl knocked on it in panic, expecting someone to open it for her. She shouted to the knight that they had forgotten dinner and threatened that if they didn't provide her with dinner now, she would start crying. But realizing that no one would open the door for her, the girl looked around her and shook with terror, dreading the dark corridor as she really didn't want to leave alone, but still she realized that there was no choice. She went out into the darkness, and after wandering up and down the stairs and corridors, she soon found a completely different door that led to a beautiful room that could truly be considered a palace. The girl confessed worriedly that she had expected to come to some damp dungeon, and here it was as if she had been assigned a single palace room. It was no surprise, though, since she was really in a palace. Then the heroine remembered about her assistant and began to worry about how he was feeling. Then the heroine remembered her assistant and began to worry about how he was doing, and then she remembered their original plan. With the help of a polymorph artifact, they should turn Terry into a fake prince, so that the disappearance of the real hair would go unnoticed. And while Terry is busy averting the eyes of palace workers who don't know what happened to the prince, they'll move the real one and heal him. She was worried about her subordinate as she wasn't sure he could handle it. After all, he was a bad actor. But I thought about it, because I remembered that sometimes he was a good actor, so I figured he should be able to handle it. Suddenly a noise came from the doorway. She thought it was Sir Knight returning, so she got up to meet him. It was indeed he, and in his arms he brought a young lad. The girl froze, looking at them, and thought he was carrying the prince like a beautiful girl from fairy tales. And after looking over his peaceful face that so radiated calmness, the guy was really beautiful and resembled Sleeping Beauty. While the knight was putting the prince to bed, she reported that he carried him straight as if she was about to continue her sentence. But the knight interrupted her fantasy and looking at her unhappily asked, "What does she mean?" The protagonist confessed with embarrassment that she had nothing more to add. She sat down on the bed with the prince, looking at his face and snow-white hair. She admitted to herself that the man was fabulously handsome. And after nervously standing up, she turned to the knight and asked if he could settle the matter of dinner. But the man said that first she must heal his highness, and then he would give her food. The girl embarrassedly remarked that she was already having a hard time and didn't think she could do it quickly, especially since she was forced to work on an empty stomach. But the knight dispassionately informed her that in that case she should start as soon as possible so she could eat whatever she wanted in peace when she was done. The girl was not pleased, but suddenly the knight announced that he had brought her the cake she had told her so much about. The protagonist was clearly pleased when she looked at the appetizing piece of cake, but she was careful not to show it. Then Sonador grudgingly warned the knight that if she woke up early due to unbearable hunger, it would be entirely his fault and responsibility. Finally sitting down on the chair beside the prince's bed, she resolutely removed her glove, ready to get to work, and contemplated what she would have to do when entering his dream. And then she took the prince's hand. At the same moment, the girl plunged into the darkness and saw a bright light towards which she began to head. This light was the subconsciousness of the crown prince. The girl thought it would take quite a long time to find this place, because when a curse is placed on a person, it is difficult to find his consciousness. However, His Highness's mind flickered so brightly, as if begging the girl to notice him. Once inside, the first thing the protagonist discovered was that the whole world was black and white. She was very surprised at this and thought that perhaps His Highness had achromasia, a disease in which all colors are perceived in black and white. And then she realized with a shock that for some reason she didn't know, she couldn't move. Looking around herself, the protagonist realized that the reason for all of this was that she had turned into a snake. She was startled by this development, but still she resolutely set out to find the consciousness master, though she mentally noted that she usually turned to whatever the master of consciousness favored the most. So she assumed that perhaps the prince was very fond of snakes. She crept quietly until a strange sound reached her ears. She was amazed to observe this world, because first the girl reincarnated into a snake, finding herself in a completely monochrome world, and now around her played a terrible song, as if she was not in the mind of the crown prince, but in the mind of a truly crazy man. At some point she was brought out of her thoughts by a strange odor that her nose picked up. The girl noticed that the odor resembled some kind of iron. Looking at the source of this odor, she found that the pit was completely filled with human skulls, and there was a whole mountain of them. The snake screamed with fear as loudly as it could and crawled away. The girl was shocked that here was an entire graveyard under the water of a seemingly beautiful lake, but ordered herself to pull herself together as she was a professional and had to behave accordingly. And afterward convinced herself that what she saw was not skulls, but just some very oddly shaped rocks underwater. Suddenly she was taken out of her attempt at self-consolation by something that rumbled right next to her and nearly crushed her. It turned out to be the paw of a huge dragon that flapped its enormous size wings, but this powerful creature was missing its head for some reason. The girl crawled away into the bushes, trying to hide from this nuisance, and didn't realize what she had to do. But suddenly she found a person standing in front of the dragon. It was the crown prince. Then he cut off what was left of the dragon's head with his sword and cut it in two. The girl was shocked that this guy was able to destroy such a dangerous beast with just one blow. And then she saw something that horrified her. The man looking at the picture of the slain dragon laughed loudly, and the girl thought that he must have gone crazy from being in this horrible world. All he uttered after killing the beast was a single word, "Father," addressed to the emperor. But after the mesmerized guy suddenly turned his gaze to the girl who was crawling close to his leg, he stood emotionlessly across the room, and after scrutinizing her, he stated that she was not a creature from his personal paradise, and in an attempt to grab her, ordered her to get out of the place. At that moment, the girl woke up, and after immediately looked at the prince, he was sleeping peacefully and smiling. The girl realized with horror that in her dream His Highness had tried to kill her. After such a tedious journey into His Highness's subconscious, the night still allowed her some respite and brought some sweets for her awakening. The girl sat contentedly and enjoyed the food, when suddenly the knight inquired as to what she thought of the situation. The protagonist, misunderstanding his question, began to enthusiastically tell how much she liked the small cupcake that Sir Knight had brought her and began to describe in detail all its flavors. But the man interrupted her and said that he was not asking about the taste of the dessert, but about the crown prince's fortune. Turning to the man and scrutinizing his peaceful face, the girl reported that outwardly he looked absolutely normal, though she awkwardly thought about the fact that his inner world was quite specific and, in her opinion, creepy. Sonador decided to ask the knight if the crown prince had experienced any stress before falling asleep, but the latter only coldly interrogated and asked her to explain the meaning of the word. The heroine looked at him unhappily and told him that he was acting like an insanely cold-blooded person who didn't care about anything, and the heroine emotionlessly informed him that he was often told something like that. Leaning back in his chair, the girl said that in principle he might not answer her question, realizing that his answers would not be helpful. And afterward she decided to ask how her friend was doing. The male knight calmly explained that if he had done something wrong, he would have been reported to him immediately, and then he wondered whether the protagonist would be able to penetrate His Highness's dream immediately after eating. The girl was about to start the dessert and explained to the knight that she was feeling quite tired, so she'd better save her strength for tomorrow, but he convinced her that tomorrow a healer would arrive from the palace who would be able to help her recover. So she should get to her duties as soon as possible. But seeing her distressed face to comfort her, the man offered to tell him what she wanted from the food when she woke up. When he assured her that she could really get anything she wanted, the girl joyfully started dreaming and listing a huge variety of delicious desserts, such as chocolate pudding, sponge cheesecake, blueberry millefeuille, honey muffins, and so on. All this time the knight was watching her in horror, not understanding how all this could fit into such a small girl, but he didn't back down and handed her a note so she could write down whatever she needed to write down. Some more time passed and the girl was once again in his subconscious. The protagonist reflected on the fact that his world was still monochrome, and then she discovered that she was still in the body of a snake, and with tears on her snake face, she wondered if the prince didn't miss a single person. And afterwards, she thought that it was strange enough that she was becoming the same creature all the time, and also grudgingly noticed that because of all this, the protagonist had already started to get used to crawling and acting like a snake. Looking around, she realized she was probably in some hall of the imperial palace. She crawled along the long and lavishly decorated corridors. Suddenly, however, a huge, unclimbable door loomed in front of her. But the girl managed to open it a little and saw the prince standing there admiring the view, who did not seem to notice her at all. But when the protagonist crawled a little closer, the prince noticed this and turned his attentive studying gaze on her. He wondered what the flowered snake was doing here again, and why she was coming into his world again without asking. And then, scrutinizing it, he asked, "Where did it come from?" After all, the fellow didn't remember creating it in his paradise. The girl looked at him in surprise and did not understand what he meant when he said paradise, and assumed that apparently the prince did not realize that it was only a dream, and suspected that there was a possibility that he was not cursed at all. After looking her over, the prince admitted that he had nothing against snakes, and even on the contrary, he liked her. And afterward, he lowered his hand and beckoned her closer to him so she could crawl on top of him. When the girl was wrapped around his arm, he was no longer looking at her with the same anger he had before and just smiled. Afterwards, he said that he assumed the snake would be able to answer his question, but they were brought out of their thoughts by a maid who entered. She brought a large tray with a variety of delicious exotic fruits, but the only thing that was very embarrassing to the girl was the complete absence of a head on her neck. But still the girl did not show her fear or surprise, and watched the man attentively. Then His Highness, taking with one hand the apple which the maid had brought him, asked the snake whether he should eat it. The girl immediately realized that this was the source. The source was a person or object that could provide her with some new information in a dream, and usually these very sources, like clues, were hidden in various corners of the dream. They are like breadcrumbs leading the owner of consciousness to the very depths of the inner world of the sleeper. Then the god watching the snake smiled silently, as if waiting for its answer. The protagonist did not understand why the prince asked the snake to answer this question. If her memory serves her correctly, snakes in principle cannot speak. But afterward, she inquired if he knew what would happen if he took a bite of the apple. And afterward, in shock, she discovered she could talk, and the man even heard her. The boy stared at the snake in shock, not understanding how the snake could talk to him so easily. Something evil lit up in his eyes, whereupon the prince laughed angrily, as if in hysterics. He brought her closer to his face and said he was surprised that she could talk. After all, no one in his paradise could talk. She was not at all surprised, but rather puzzled, wondering if it wasn't obvious to the prince that no one spoke to him because all the creatures in this world had no head. His Highness scrutinized the snake in his hand and wondered that perhaps it wasn't actually a snake at all. The girl didn't understand how it happened and how the prince could guess. Usually you can't tell a sleeping person that what is happening is just a dream, and she is a creature not of this world. Otherwise, the entities living in the world of the sleeper would immediately push her back into reality. But the prince already knows that everything is unreal, and there are not so many entities around. Moreover, the girl realized that even headless entities, sooner or later will still realize that the girl snake, a stranger who penetrated into their world, so after thinking about the pros and cons, she decided to take a chance. The main character informed His Highness that she is not from his paradise and she is indeed not a snake. Then the prince was mesmerized. Looking at her, he inquired, "Who is she and how did she come to be here?" Sonadora informed him that she was the master of dreams and introduced herself to him, giving her name. The boy was surprised by this, so he asked what her job was as a dream maker and suggested that perhaps she could enter other people's dreams. And then he wondered if she was hired by his father. The girl informed him that that was why it was here, to wake him from his eternal slumber. But suddenly a headless maid loomed over them. The boy looked at her and said that it looked like she was going to be killed here, and she wondered excitedly how the prince had guessed it. Then he said that he realized it from the maid's reaction. He said that he had realized it from the maid's reaction because even though she was headless, all creatures like her were unable to talk, but they could hear everything. The girl in the snake's body looked worriedly at the departing maid. The girl in the snake's body worriedly watched the maid leave, and then said that it seemed to her that since the prince knew so much and understood the unreality of what was happening, it should have been all right, but apparently the entity still wanted to kill her. The prince, bestowing a radiant smile on her, informed her that it was better not to use that word wake, as the malevolence of that servant girl was quite no joke. The protagonist had already gotten excited about how touching it was of the prince to save her, but the one who spoiled the whole atmosphere told the snake that he needed some answers to some questions. So she shouldn't be in a hurry to die. And afterwards, he asked how long he had been asleep because he seemed to have lost track of time while he was wandering through his world. Then the girl calmly answered that he had not woken up for about 2 weeks, but she could not say anything more precisely. She could not say more precisely than that. The prince then asked how he could get back out and suggested that perhaps he should head for the snake. She started to say that it wasn't that simple and to wake him up. She was about to continue, but then she noticed that at this word the maid came very close to her. Then the girl immediately faltered and stopped talking before finishing her sentence. She realized that for this the maid could take her life and she would be thrown out of this world. And then, more veilingly, told the prince that everything could change if he ate the source, as it would allow them to get to deeper layers of subconsciousness. Guy looked back at the tray of fruit and asked what she meant by the source, and following the snake's gaze he assumed she was referring to the fruit on the table. The girl gazed at the apple and tried to understand if it could be the source. Then the prince asked what the depths of subconsciousness were. He confessed that all this time he did not dare to try them, and it seemed to be for the best. The girl, still lying snake-faced on the shining apple, asked, "Doesn't he have any idea what it is at all?" But His Highness said he had no idea. Throughout his stay here, some inexplicable inner feeling told him that he should eat the fruit. She informed him that his guesses were correct and explained that if he didn't eat them, nothing would change and he would just stay in the place. The guy looked at the snake that was wrapped around his hand, which was hanging around the apple, and said that if the protagonist wanted to eat it, she should tempt him. She looked at him silently, not understanding what she should do, but the prince just kept smiling good-naturedly. Watching her, the girl seemed shocked by such a suggestion and thought that the prince must be expecting some kind of hypnotic snake dance from her. And then, focusing her attention on the music around her, she reasonably remarked that she would have danced, but definitely not to that awful tune that was coming from everywhere. Then the prince, noticing her confusion, explained that in all myths snakes were the tempters, so he expected something eloquent from her. Then the girl calmed down, realizing that at least she would not have to dance, and said that now she had an idea of what kind of temptation he wanted to get from her. Then the protagonist began to explain that if the depths of his mind scared him a lot, then to cope with it the girl offered him to keep him company on this journey and be his companion in this world. She told him that she was with him now, to help him overcome it. She asked him what he feared most, an uncertain future, or perhaps a past he could not change, no matter how much he regretted it. And afterwards, she told him that no matter what, the past must be left behind, and she would help the prince overcome all difficulties by staying by his side. Then the prince, scrutinizing her, asked how he could trust her. Then she, wrapping herself more securely on his arm and looking intently into his eyes, informed him that he could trust her as other people do, believing the speeches of the tempter. And afterwards, she told him that if he wanted to share his worries with her, he was free to do so, and she was ready to listen to him, and also promised to take every, even the smallest of his secrets with her to the grave. Though she sensibly remarked that she would, in any case, if things didn't work out, go there soon, but she didn't say it out loud. The guy let her go from his arm and informed her that he couldn't trust her very much, but he was willing to go for it anyway, since even if nothing good came out of it, at least traveling with her he wouldn't be so bored with life. And after taking a bite of this apple, then the girl woke up abruptly, and the first thing she saw in front of her was an unfamiliar man leaning over her, who inquired, "Did the girl sleep well?" Te was shocked and covered herself with a blanket, asking and even demanding that the stranger who came introduce himself and explain himself. He bowed and announced that he was His Highness's personal healer, and his name was Haggett. Haggett nursed the protagonist back to health and gave her a relaxing massage so she could feel a little better after traveling and be able to get to work with His Highness immediately. She complimented his talents and felt an incredible relief in her body. And then, looking at the disgruntled and irritated face of the knight sitting across from her, which didn't bode well and which clearly made the tension in the room linger, she turned to the healer and asked what had happened between them. The one smiling brightly and lighting up all around informed him that nothing of the sort had happened, and he and Sir Christian had simply discussed some business. He still looked at the healer unhappily and told him that he should talk less and work more, because that's what they had called him for. The girl grudgingly remarked that she was trying to recover in order to get to work, but with this atmosphere it was becoming impossible. But afterwards an idea came into her head, and she reported that while she was in His Highness's mind, she realized the reason why he had chosen to sleep. She reported her suspicions that the prince had decided to escape to his personal paradise away from everyone. Then the knight inquired what she meant by paradise. The protagonist reported her suspicions that the prince was probably in some kind of transition, and the healer suggested that it was sleepwalking, perhaps teenage rebellion. The heroine agreed and said that His Highness had escaped into the bowels of sleep, but now they don't understand how to get out. The knight, taking the cup and about to take a sip, indicated that he understood what Sonador meant, and then said that she should get him out of there anyway, since she had already realized the reason. She looked at him unhappily and said, "Does he really mean it? After all, she works without rest." She also complained that because of the long stay underground she couldn't stand it, not only physically but also mentally, and asked him to let her walk a little and get some fresh air. The knight impartially informed her that in that case she should not waste her time, but should get to work as soon as possible, as she had already slept half the day. She grudgingly thought that sometimes this knight seemed even scarier than the emperor, but remembering her assistant, she decided to inquire about his well-being. Knight reported that Terry was fine, and he also asked to be told that he was going crazy from lying under the covers all the time. The girl was angry, thinking that he was extremely lucky and complaining, and she had a much harder job. Then the protagonist decided to get to work. The knight only wished her luck, and then he left her alone. Then the girl turned to him and asked him not to be bored during her absence and offered him to finish her ginger cookies. But the man coldly replied that no one needed her cookies but herself, and the other one, clearly displeased, joked that if Christian kept talking to everyone so meanly, all the cookies would run right off his plate and he'd never see them again. The man grudgingly reached for the ball and ordered her to get to work immediately. At that moment, the girl realized that it seemed time to stop joking with this intimidating man. As she touched his hand, she was once again plunged into darkness, but realized that, to her surprise, she could not feel his consciousness at all. So, rising and turning to the knight, she inquired, "Can the contact zone with the prince be increased?" He didn't quite understand what she meant, so he asked again. The girl explained as gently as possible that the palm of her hand was not enough to get into his subconsciousness, so she could try to hug him. When she finished her explanation, she ran into the very displeased face of the knight, who was reaching for his sword as he thought the girl was acting very suspiciously. But she looked at him in all seriousness and informed him that it would be just a normal hug and she wasn't planning anything disgusting. Then the knight, calming down, said a little excitedly that he wasn't sure he could resolve such things on his own, as it wasn't his area of responsibility. Then the girl sighed and explained that he should take into account that she was his doctor now, and everything she was doing was only to help His Highness wake up as soon as possible, and his case was more serious than he realized. So he will have to use the most powerful techniques he can. With a sigh, the knight informed her that he was giving her permission to do what she had planned. Then the girl, having apologized to the prince in advance, lay in his bed and afterwards discovered that while working with him, because of his graceful facial features, she had completely failed to notice that he had such a beautiful and godlike body. But then she faltered, ordering herself not to think about such things, since he was a patient and she was his doctor. So no matter how incredibly handsome a guy he was, the heroine should behave like a professional. Then the girl relaxed and leaned her forehead against his chest and was finally able to enter his subconscious. She was surprised that everything was black and white again and realized that there was no progress in his treatment. But afterward I discovered I was no longer a snake and noticed I had tiny legs, wings, and a tail. She asked blankly, didn't the apple have any effect? But then she was brought out of her musings aloud by the voice of the prince, who informed her that progress was clearly visible as this was no longer entirely his paradise. She jumped with fear but fell into the guy's hand. The one looked at the chick in his hands with confusion and asked, did she instead of a snake this time turn into a bird that can't fly? Afterward, the prince asked, why does the girl appear in a new guise every time? While the prince stroked her feathers, the heroine informed him that it wasn't her fault, as the look was entirely up to his personal preference. The prince lifted her in his arms, afterward asking, can he bite her? The little bird seemed insanely cute as she was frightened by his question. Then the girl asked His Highness how he could easily recognize her every time, but he informed that it was easy enough since she had a head and smiled sweetly at her. She was clearly unhappy with that answer, though she realized that the answer was honest enough, because really no living creature in his paradise had a head. Afterwards, the prince reminded the girl that when she was still in the form of a snake, she had promised him that she would always be there for him, and that was probably the reason why she kept appearing in front of him, and also why he could easily recognize her every time. But suddenly the guy noticed something and started looking at something in surprise. The girl noticed this change in his face and asked, what happened? But the man, still looking at her in surprise, said that after the bird had appeared in his world, it had become much warmer and there was a strange feeling of softness. The girl immediately realized that he could probably feel her hugging him in reality and was very embarrassed by it. The one immediately noticed the embarrassment on a little fledgling's face and smiled encouragingly at her so that she wouldn't feel so awkward. But it seems that such a nice warm feeling made even the prince himself embarrassed. And then to change the subject, I asked her if she'd let me bite her. It immediately jumped out of his palm and started jumping on the table, telling him that there was no need to bite it because it was not edible. Then she looked around and asked if His Highness recognized this place. Sonador mentally noted that it looked like a garden. Then the young lad informed her that they were in the Palace of Friezes. The girl was surprised at this answer. Afterward she asked, where are all the friezes in this garden? But the guy leaned across the table and explained that his mom had taken care of the garden while she was alive. So that's what it looks like now. The protagonist excitedly asked why he couldn't imagine a garden of that time with flowers on every corner, fragrances, and everything inherent in a garden. But the prince sadly and with a kind of despair reported that he could not do so, and after conceiving it he continued to look around the place. Chickadee Girl wondered why can't he do it, and perhaps it has something to do with the fact that he is no longer in his paradise. The prince answered, still looking thoughtfully around the garden, that it was not quite so, and then he said that his memory was very bad and his mind was in chaos. Then he confessed that in his paradise he was able to control everything, but here he could barely control the terrain. The girl suspected this might happen. She immediately realized that they were in a deeper layer of his subconscious this time, so her palm was not enough. Since the barrier had definitely strengthened, and the more the prince would lose control, the harder it would be for her to invade his dreams. Then the girl turned to His Highness and told him that in order to return to reality, he needed to seek out certain sources, and also said that he would be unconsciously drawn to them like those apples, and asked if there was anything like that in this place. She jumped on his arm, and then she heard the guy's question, wondering how he could even realize he found exactly what he needed. The girl reported that the source could be anything that could be meaningful to him, For him, it could be a certain place or thing, but also some actions, beliefs, desires, for example, like love or faith. In short, it can be absolutely anything. And after resolutely placing her wings at her side, Sonador informed that the prince was in good hands, as she was a master of her craft, and then informed that almost all of the above had something to do with secret desires from the past, and warned that nothing in a dream is random. And afterwards she promised to help him. He felt sharply as if something had touched his arm, and that touch was something out of this world. It was a woman's hand, and it had a color unlike his hands. Afterward, the man picked himself up and looking at the little fledgling, wondered if he would be able to wake up if he found such a source. She immediately realized that the word wake up was something that was taboo not to be named. She trembled, realizing that something bad was likely to happen to her now. But the prince, smarting at her reaction, said she was being very nice. The girl, unhappily folding her wings in the back, realized that His Highness had been mocking her all this time. Then the prince, wiping the tears of laughter from his eyes, said he suspected that nothing would happen to her if it was him speaking. At least not yet. The girl looked at him in surprise, not understanding the meaning of such a temporary clarification. Then the prince, seeing her bewilderment, explained that when he said this word in his paradise, headless men appeared and brought him what he liked, a treat or board games, as if they did not want him to wake up. But after looking around his garden, he stated that, as the girl had already noticed, no one appeared after he had eaten that source apple, and it seemed that if he followed the chick, nothing good was waiting for him. The one immediately started flapping her wings and convincing him that it was absolutely not true. The guy only said that these are his concerns, but he hopes they turn out to be unfounded. But he's not going to accuse her of anything. Then the girl, in an attempt to take off, said that she was sure there was some definite reason why the prince was in this particular garden, and flying on his shoulder, suggested that she look for some flowers that might be his source. The one listening to the fledgling watched her intently while she continued to tell him that if this palace was a palace of freesias, the prince should try to create them. But he said sadly that he didn't think it would help. Then the girl tried to encourage and persuade him, saying that he should try it. The guy squeezed his hand and tried to create a small flower, but it didn't work out okay. Then she suggested that it might be possible to create some other flowers. The prince said that he remembered his flower, which belonged to his horoscope, but immediately said that it was not a good idea to try to recreate it. But still he tried it. Small gray flowers appeared in his hand called Thanatos or death flowers. The girl woke up and realized she had been pushed out of his mind. Her whole body was crazily aching after being asleep for so long. She was still remembering his face when he said the alternate name of the horoscope colors. The girl tearfully admitted that she was already tired of working with the prince. Even after a simple session, she felt sick, and here was such a complicated order. She thought it might be the best option to try to escape in the middle of the night. But afterwards she decided to pull herself together. She stood up and fixed her clothes after the healer had given her a massage. She thanked him and told him that she had forgotten to introduce herself. When she said her name, Thoth informed her with a smile that her name sounded perfectly like Sweet Dreams, which was how her name sounded in the language of the Ark Empire. He shook her hand and told her that she had an appropriate name for her profession. She thanked him sincerely again for his help and awkwardly told him that she had been very ill when she first woke up, but that she felt much better now. The one informed with a little embarrassment that he really has golden hands in this regard. But after the girl noticed that all this time he was talking to her on you. Apparently, this healer didn't know how old she was at all, so she asked him about it. The man reported that he thought the main character was about 20-something years old. Afterwards, he assumed that she was about 23. The girl was shocked that he guessed the first time and thought that maybe he had the ability of telepathy. But afterwards he told her that he was not a telepath at all. The girl was 10 times more shocked than before, but the healer said that Sonadora had everything written on her face, and then smilingly told the girl that if she wished, she could call him brother. The healer was already starting to annoy her, but she said she would refrain and preferred to call him by his first name. Rubbing her eyes from fatigue, she admitted that this guy was really tiring her out and he was acting like a real energy vampire. But suddenly a healer crept up from behind her and started calling out to her, whispering her name in her ear. She was frightened and started calling for the night. When he entered the room, she complained to him that Mr. Healer seemed to have gone completely insane, and the healer looked at her in bewilderment and asked what he had done wrong. He had only given her a massage and tried to make friends with her. But the girl accused him of impudent lying and said that he had whispered something in her ear and read her thoughts. The girl accused him of lying and said that he had whispered something in her ear and read her thoughts. Hadget told the heroine that her brother was only trying to make a joke on her, and the protagonist was outraged, saying that he was not her brother at all, as she was the only child in the family. Their shouting made the knight feel weary and ordered them both to be quiet. Turning to the healer, he warned that he should be aware of how important the Sonador was to the Empire right now, so he should treat her with the respect she deserved and not pester her. He smiled and said that Christian was the perfect brother for the main character, and after touching his hand he said that he had a great physique and that every lady would dream of having one. As he began to pluck at his chest, Hadget said with embarrassment that muscles like a knight's were a fairy tale. He got embarrassed and was clearly very angry at the healer's behavior, and after beating him, left him near the wall. The girl observed the beaten man and asked the knight how such a man could even become His Highness's personal physician, and wondered if the emperor tolerated such his behavior. The knight, still unhappy with what had happened, said that he usually doesn't behave like this in the palace and gives the impression that he is very calm and diligent. The protagonist, with skepticism, reported that it was hard to believe that such a person could behave like that. Afterwards, she asked what made him change so dramatically, but Hadget got up from his seat and, weeping but with a smile, said that they were going to die anyway, so they had nothing to fear and should make the most of life. Then the girl realized that the healer seemed to be as desperate as she was. Then, unexpectedly for the protagonist in the room where they were, the door opened, behind which was her assistant with another guard. Terry was insanely happy to see her. They hugged joyfully and spun with the happiness of reunion. But then the girl looked at him carefully and immediately realized that, apparently, something had happened. Then Terry confessed that he seemed very guilty. The guard confirmed his words and said that the man should be grateful for staying alive, especially since he was even given a chance to make things right. The girl looked at the guard and wondered what her boy had done. She treated Terry as her own son. The guard only coldly told her to ask her subordinate about it. Then he turned and left. As soon as he left, the girl looked at the guy unhappily and asked him what he had time to do, since his tasks were just to lie there and do nothing. Terry excused himself that he was, and though his acting ability left much to be desired, lying down was what he was good at. Then he began his story by saying that a servant had come to see him and told him that Lady Anderson wished to see him. The Crown Prince had always been rather quiet, like a smoldering ash. The attendants praised the young man with one voice, predicting him to reign for many years to come. But the majority of the officials were not so optimistic. They believed that His Highness was pursuing a strategy of giving in for the sake of compromise and giving in rather easily, and was usually the first to extend his hand with a smile. Some took him for a tiger hiding its claws. Others rather considered him a jewel that does not shine. One of the officials suggested that the weak-spirited heir might become a pawn in the hands of his own subordinates once he ascended the throne, so he thought he needed a companion to keep him on the right path. All this he was telling Isabella, who was being prepared to take the place of this companion. So she went to the prince. The maids tried to stop my lady, but she did not listen at all and went to the room, and the worried girls ran after her. Lady Anderson burst into the Crown Prince's room, and immediately from the threshold she came and clung to his breast. Then Terry remembered that the knight had said that his duties were to pretend to be sick and lie in bed and not talk to anyone, and he also said that the acting Manhwa should be arriving soon and his job was to hold out until then. He watched the girl in horror as she clung to him and didn't understand how he should behave, for he hadn't been warned about this. Isabella turned to him with tears in her eyes and told him that she had heard that he was not well and came at once. She hoped very much that the prince would not resent her for such behavior. He said he was very glad to meet my lady, but she recoiled in shock and said she knew he was angry because he spoke to her very dryly. Afterward, she asked him if it was so hard for him to call out to her as he had done before. The guy stood shocked, not understanding how he could know what this girl was previously called by the Crown Prince. Isabella was watching him at the time and said that he was acting insanely cold. Then she suggested that perhaps he was so sick that he could not think straight, and afterward admitted her mistake for having rushed the visit. The lady said she had been confused by his face, for it did not look sick at all. She tried to touch Terry in the form of a prince, but he immediately broke free of her grip. The girl looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what had happened. The boy realized at once that his image had come to an end, for he jerked his hand away in fear. The girl was watching him closely and seemed to suspect something. She bowed and told him that he was behaving strangely and suggested that today was not a good day for her visit. So she let out a faint tear and fled, promising to pray for his health. A man was watching the girl running out of the Crown Prince's room and smiled smugly. He smiled smugly and then headed for the door that led to His Highness's chambers. There, Terry and the knight were having a serious conversation. The knight reprimanded the lad for almost bringing the girl to the point where she could realize that he was only a fake, and afterward informed him that if he failed, he would be skinned if Lady Anderson's engagement to the prince was broken off. At this time, they were interrupted by a suspicious man who informed them that he would not allow it. He smiled and introduced himself, saying that his name was Giuseppe and that he had come here on His Majesty's orders and would be Terry's personal acting coach. And after addressing the knight in all seriousness, Giuseppe warned him not to speak on the subject of fake princes almost to the whole palace. And after spreading his arms good-naturedly, he promised that the engagement with Lady Anderson would not be broken off, as he would have a private word with her about it. Terry, rising to his feet, grabbed his hand and thanked him. And afterward he said he couldn't imagine what he could do for him as a thank you. But Giuseppe, putting his arm around his waist, informed him that he could easily pay him in kind. The girl, listening to all this, realized that they had both gotten some pretty strange people. And then she said that the most important thing was that he was unharmed, and then warned her that she should get back to work. Terry promised that he'd be there to keep an eye on her. Afterward, he grabbed a chair to pull her closer and told her that those chairs were very comfortable, so she'd be insanely comfortable working. But afterward, he was shocked to find the girl climbing onto the prince's bed. He did not understand what had happened and asked what she was doing, but Sonador, who was used to it, explained that she was going to get to work and then explained that, alas, there was no other way she could catch the mind of His Highness. At that time, the healer asked Tyr to go play with his brother. He watched him in shock, not understanding how he should behave. The healer asked him why he was interfering with the main character. The girl looked at those noisy young men, and they immediately became silent. And after the Sonador calmed down in the long-awaited silence, she hugged the prince and sank into his sleep. Once there, she found that the world had become colorful, and she was pleased with this progress. She turned into a fox, but suddenly, unexpectedly, she was lifted up by someone's hands. It was the prince, who smiled at her and told her that the girl had made him wait a long time. Sonador was very displeased, for last time he himself had chased her out of her dream, so striking him with her paws, she jumped away. The prince, looking at her sadly, asked for at least a hug, but she, not satisfied, informed him that she was worried he might push her out of his mind again, and afterward wondered if he had any idea how she felt about being kicked out of her dream. The prince had no idea how she felt, so he inquired, and the vixen confessed that every time she wakes up she feels excruciating pain.